everyone. Tony Tonkin here from Wise, Witty and Weird. Glad you could be with me again to talk about things that are any of those three things, and heaven only knows which one of those will be relevant in this particular discussion. One of the things I wanted to talk about is how we're trusting our governments, or how we're perhaps not trusting our governments, whichever way you care to look at it and however you care to feel about it. And it's interesting to note that here in Australia, for whatever reason, we seem to be trusting them more. And does this mean that politicians are being more honest to us? Are they telling us the truth? Are they working with us differently? Or is it just that we have a pandemic and they've risen to the occasion to do the things that they should have been doing all along, which is about being transparent, being honest, not hiding to us, not hiding from us exactly what has been happening. And I'd like to draw a contrast particularly with the United States, where their politicians have taken a completely different perspective, not only just around the pandemic, but around the resources that they offer to help people battle with the consequences of a pandemic, which are things like money, income, unemployment, mental well-being. And here in Australia, I think we've done a pretty good job at looking after our population in terms of JobKeeper and other programs that have been put in place. And even from my perspective as a social worker, extending the amount of sessions that someone can have under a mental health care plan. So there's many things that our parliamentarians have done which has been outstanding. Now, the question for me is, why can't they be like that all the time? Why is it that we don't believe them and don't trust them to start with? But an interesting report came out from an organisation called the Scanlon Institute. Now, I personally have no idea who in the hell the Scanlon Institute are. However, they were quoted in The Guardian, and I believe they're reputable, they're an okay organisation. And that they have been able to map social cohesion. And they put out a report which indicates to us that there are significant changes being made in relation to how we're approaching and how we see and how we view our politicians. And this primarily has come about through the pandemic. And I see that as a good thing, because in this particular country, we don't necessarily trust politicians, as do most people throughout the world, I guess. And we're not as divided and as partisan as you may find in the United States, for example, where they couldn't get out of their way to help their neighbour no matter what bloody well happened. And I find that really distressing, that the country that is supposed to be the cornerstone of democracy and provide us with the light on the hill and all the other crap that they carry on with, that they have not been able to rise to the occasion, which is probably a greater indication as to who they are as a country, and all that has been brought to light. Whereas in Australia, we've kind of always believed in the fair go, I think, and that even our politicians believe in the notion that everybody needs to be helped and that we need to help our neighbours, even though I must confess from time to time I do wonder about certain political persuasions who don't seem to give a rat's ass about those that sit on the fringes. But I guess something like a pandemic impacts everybody. So if you're sitting on the fringes, or if you're wealthy, whether you're the middle class, whether you're privileged, I guess people realise that you're likely to be impacted by something like a pandemic. So the report, though, that came out said this. I just want to highlight some of them. So the initial findings from the Scanlon Foundation Mapping Social Cohesion report shows 85% of support for the federal government response to the pandemic. Now, that's response to the pandemic. We just need to highlight that very simple and obvious fact. While backing for some state governments exceeded, so the state governments themselves were far more significant in terms of the support they were receiving than the federal government was, because it was state governments that took on the responsibility of managing and looking after the particular states in their response to the pandemic. And I guess that is interesting, because specifically in the United States, what we've noticed is that the states refused to take responsibility to some extent, and even if they did take some responsibility, they were prohibited from accessing the federal resources in order for them to meet the issues at hand. So what happened was that many states were fighting against the federal government. Here in Australia, though, the federal government formed a national cabinet which got everybody from each state together, and they worked on the issue as one problem in a very bipartisan way, and that brought about a result which was exceptional, as it's turned out. So just to read a little bit further from this report, which I think is quite significant in terms of us trying to understand how people can change in terms of their view of another group of people, is this particular report. And in this report, it goes on to say that and so this is I forget who it is that's talking about this. So the quote is, this is from Andrew Marcus, that's right. That's quite an extraordinary finding, talking about the 90% and so forth. Usually we get very little change in the surveys from just 1 year to the next. Now, of course, we don't often get a pandemic, so you'd expect a shift in opinion, but the shift in opinion is moving in a positive direction with regards to governments. So this means that we are at least perhaps trusting governments, and I'm just wondering, I guess, how long that's going to last. Like, is once the pandemic's over, will that 90% for state governments and the rest for and the 55%, I guess, for federal government, will that start to diminish as we get back and start focusing on the other issues that affect all of us, such as poverty, unemployment, climate change, homelessness, mental well-being, and the list goes on. So as we get back to facing those particular issues, does that mean then that things are likely to shift back to the pre-COVID normal? I'm hoping it doesn't. I'm hoping that we can, as a population, as people, we can find a continued appreciation of our politicians. Because, actually, I don't believe that politicians, many of them, I admit, go into it because they wish to have some sense of power and control. And that's an important aspect of who they are. I think a number of politicians go into it genuinely to want to change the system so that people have better outcomes. However, I'm not convinced that once you get into power, once you do occupy a seat in Parliament, that you then acquiesce to the status quo, which is dominated by, in this country, the two major parties, as it is in many other countries. So I'm hoping, though, that at the end of the day, we'll take a look at all of this and we'll say, well, the change is worth having. That maybe governments will realise that their popularity is based on doing the right thing, and that they'll continue to do the right thing so that people will feel more confident in the decisions that they make. Because it's clear that from the pandemic, the decisions that they've now been making have been about everyone, no matter who you are. No one gets left out of this system. And maybe there's an important thing for us to remember is that and I heard people say this all the time, and I find it a wee bit boring, but, the pandemic, the virus doesn't necessarily discriminate, doesn't matter who you are. It does tend to focus, I guess it does tend to impact, not focus, it does tend to impact people of colour more than it does everybody else, primarily because people of colour sometimes have some social issues that impact them. That means that they're perhaps a little not as healthy as a lot of more privileged people are, and as a result, the virus can impact them in a more deadlier way. So, but I'm hoping that from this, the lessons that politicians can learn is that their popularity will now depend on them doing the right thing for the general population, not just for a few. So, thanks everybody for being with me, and I really look forward to catching up you with the next time on Wise, Witty and Weird. Take care, look after yourself and be safe.